Hi all, thank you so much for joining us today at the Attention Recession webinar looking at how inflation and the pandemic are shaping entertainment. My name is Sian Tedessa, I'm the Communications Coordinator here at MIDiA Research. As we are seeing the MIDiA predicted Attention Recession coming into fruition, our in-house analyst will take you through the key insights and trends of this new chapter across music, video, games, marketing, and audio industries. So today with us, we have Mark Mulligan, our Managing Director and Music Analyst. We have Tim Mulligan, our Research Director and Lead Video Analyst. We have Carol Severin, our Senior Games Analyst and VP of Data. We have Hannah Kallert, our Cultural Trends Analyst. We have Tatiana Sirisano, our Music Industry Analyst and Consultant. And we have Annie Langston, our Audio Analyst. So this webinar is being live streamed across YouTube, Facebook, LinkedIn, and Twitter. So if you have any questions throughout this session, please add your questions in the comment section and one of our analysts will be able to answer it for you. So to kick off this webinar, Mark will be coming up to share with us some data to show us how consumers will change behavior and how their behavior has already changed. So I'm going to invite up Mark.
Thanks, Sian. Hi, everyone. Thanks for joining us. So unfortunately, this is not going to be the most cheery of sessions because fundamentally what we're going to be talking about is what is at the very least going to be a period of real uncertainty over the coming months and perhaps even years. What we're going to be walking through, I'm going to walk you through some of our latest data in just a moment, but really just to set the scene here, what we're talking about is a whole bunch of different things happening at the same time. So the headline, which this webinar is based around, is the attention recession, and that's the bit that's really sort of shaped fundamentally by entertainment, and that is we have right up until the pandemic, we had in the attention economy, so that's the time that people spend with entertainment. We reached peak just as the pandemic hit. So what that meant was all of our spare time had basically gone. And then there was, the pandemic came along, and we had the sort of people sat at home with cash in their pockets and time on their hands, and we ended up with a real surge in all forms of entertainment that didn't require you to actually go somewhere. But this was an artificial boost, right? Because really what happened was a temporary shift. And then when everybody started going back to work, then of course all of that extra time started to disappear. So we were already coming into this retraction period, the attention recession. And it's a process which is going to take some time to play out. We've still got time to come yet. We don't have, for example, everybody back to the office 5 days a week. The odds are most of those people who've been working from home will not be spending all of the time working in the office anymore, but instead some of the time. So that does mean that the amount of attention that was gained during the lockdown period, not all of it will go. Nonetheless, it is going to be a period of contraction. You've seen some slowdown in various numbers reported by various entities. And then on top of that, we've got the economic situation changing. We've got, because of already prior to the Russo-Ukrainian war, we had rising prices, inflation was already beginning to rise, fuel prices were already beginning to rise. Now that has gone and accelerated very markedly, with inflation rates in many key markets in the sort of 7 to 9% mark. Fuel and food prices in particular rising. The war is going to constrain supply, both of those accelerating it even further. And then interest rates are going up as well, which means that people who borrowed money, or entities which are borrowing money to go and buy media assets, etc., those are going to sort of slow as well. So you've got all of these things coming together. So what did we do? MIDiA being MIDiA, we went and asked consumers about a few months ago in advance to work out what consumers think they would do as a consequence of all of this happening. So what you can see here in the slide, this is we asked consumers, if you faced the price increases and cost of living going up so much that you were struggling to make ends meet, then how would you change your entertainment and leisure spending? The dark blue bars are basically predominantly the nighttime economy. It's people going out to eat, going to concerts. And then the light blue is the digital entertainment. So it's a reasonably clear trend there, right? What we see is that people are far more likely to say they'll eat out less and go out less than they are cut a digital subscription. And that makes sense, because that doing less of something is not doing nothing of something. But if you were to cancel your music subscription, then you are going to lose benefits of all the benefits of a paid music subscription. You stop your game subscription, then you suddenly no longer have access to a whole bunch of games you've been playing. So there is it's a more definitive move. The exception is video subscriptions, where it's very common for people to have more than one video subscription, and as a consequence, cancelling a video subscription simply also means doing a bit less of. And indeed, maybe what we will see as a long-term impact of the sort of recessionary impacts on people's video is that behavior is that we'll just end up with this idea of the savvy switchers, people who just dipping out for the favorite shows every now and then on video services, will become far more established as normal behavior. Okay, so we move on to the next slide. We asked a similar question back in 2019. The background of the foreground for a period of time. So a lot of those same dynamics are at play. But nonetheless, we ask consumers at that stage, how would you change your behaviors? And as you can see, it's a remarkably similar set of responses. The main difference being that back in 2019, people were more pessimistic about a quite esoteric financial recession, economic recession, than they were just a couple of months ago about a much more tangible cost of living crisis. Whether that optimism will be borne out or not remains to be seen. Okay, we just move on to the next slide. Here's just looking at how things look a bit in terms of actually how is it affecting the market. We're looking at Spotify subscribers, Netflix subscribers, Spotify free monthly users, and Snapchat daily users. We've obviously got a much more comprehensive data set, but this is just to sort of give you some sort of leading indicators. Very simply put, by from Q1 22, so right at the start of this cost of living crisis, what do we see? We see that paid user growth is slowing down, free user growth is increasing. And if we move on to the next slide, so what that does, that lays some really clear foundations, right? If you're going into some sort of recessionary environment, if people can't afford to spend as much, then that should be a really good time for free services to pick up a lot of the slack. The only downside is when you look at the revenue trend in Q1, then actually subscription revenue is doing pretty well. The growth is not really slowing that much, but ad revenue always dips in Q1. There's a really big boost in Q4, and then a dip back in Q1 before it recovers again. But the dip is bigger than it has been in previous years. So clearly we have a sort of a mixture of quite challenging trends. On the one hand, paid user growth is slowing because more people are opting for free, but advertisers aren't spending as much money on advertising, so it's harder to monetize those free users. So in a worst case scenario, then what we're looking at really is a case of maybe a holding pattern for the digital entertainment economy. It's a case of, okay, let's just say subscriber growth slows, churn increases, then at least make sure we keep those audiences engaged within free services, even if we can't properly monetize them in the time period, so that when the economy begins to pick up, when consumer confidence increases, when advertiser spend increases, when people start spending subscriptions again, then it should be a relatively easy transition back to where we were. Okay, so that's all from me. What I'm going to do now is hand over to my colleague Tatiana, who's going to walk through about how some of these things particularly play out in music. We're specifically as well looking to select subscriber and free user growth. So over to you, Tati.
Thanks so much, Mark. So people probably are not going to stop streaming music anytime soon. But as Mark was showing us, as consumers cut costs, many are shifting to ad-supported tiers for music streaming. So in this slide, we can already see this reflected in Spotify's most recent reports, where ad-supported subscription growth is outpacing paid, particularly over the last year or so, and honestly, even over the last quarter. So this kind of reflects how, once again, music is the canary in the coal mine here, because with music streaming, it's quite easy to switch to free and still have a pretty high quality experience. Whereas with other entertainment forms, maybe there's a higher opportunity cost to switching over. This is going to start a domino effect, which we'll look at in the next slide, that will serve as the second catalyst for artists to move beyond streaming for revenue and for fan engagement. The first being the pandemic, which put a spotlight on the fact that most artists will never reach the scale needed to earn meaningful income from streaming. So just to break down the impact a little bit, as paid user streaming growth slows and free users increase, streaming is going to face a lot more intense competition for users, which means that rather than trying to grow their own user bases independently, each individual streaming service is increasingly fighting to take users away from other services, so sort of cannibalizing each other's user bases. This also means that artists are earning even less from streaming than they already were. What all of this leads to is that in this hyper-competitive landscape, fandom is going to move up the value chain, because fandom is, in the end, what helps consumers decide what to actually spend their attention on. And it's also a lot more efficient for artists to monetize than just pure consumption. So this means passive audiences are no longer enough for artists, and they need to cultivate and monetize fandom, which often means focusing more on niche fan bases than on these sort of mainstream, mass, but passive audiences. And I think that could actually be, to kind of have a positive twist here, a positive thing for music, that it sort of forces the industry to focus more on fandom than they have in a while. So again, the final effects for this, this is the second catalyst for artists to move beyond streaming and spend more time on platforms that build and remunerate fandom. This also means that they're moving beyond recording revenue and striving to capture non-music monetization, things like social content, film, television, sync, all sorts of other things. And this also means that labels will probably strive to capture some of that revenue, which means that they also need to sort of reposition their value and justify why they should have a hand in those revenue streams. And then finally, when it comes to DSPs, DSPs will need new strategies, not only to retain users, but also to retain artists, because artists are going to be focusing more on other platforms that help them cultivate fandom. So this could mean that DSPs strive for differentiation in terms of the type of content they provide or the experience they provide, and also in terms of adding tools that do cultivate and monetize fandom, such as digital fandom badges or social features and things like that. So this is just a snapshot of how all of this will impact music. And now over to video, where my colleague Tim will discuss how the macro attention recession and the cost of living crisis trends are accelerating the long-term shift to streaming TV.
Thank you, Tati. Hi, so my focus for this webinar is going to be looking at the streaming video implications of the looming attention recession. So I've got one chart to share with you here, and this chart shows long-term trends for single video subscriptions and multiple video subscriptions. So the reason why I've identified this chart as being a bellwether for understanding implications for the attention recession in the video landscape is the willingness to pay for multiple video subscriptions is an indication of available time and interest for engaging with video as a digital entertainment proposition, particularly in the light of not just the fact that we're in this post-lockdown environment where there's been that 12% increase in time available for home entertainment, of which TV and streaming video were big winners. In the post-COVID lockdown environment, we've had the return of in real life entertainment alternatives, which is starting to push back, and that leading to the attention recession we're talking about today at the webinar. But also we've got a looming cost of living crisis as well. And with inflation running at close to 10% in developed markets, it's the first time ever in the digital economy that consumers are having to factor in inflation, making it prohibitively expensive to have multiple subscriptions. Now, this slide here shows that there has been growth over the couple of years identified in this, well, 4 years identified in this chart. There's definitely been growth in the subscriptions, but we seem to be reaching a ceiling, and a ceiling of just under half of all consumers are subscribing to video services. Now, we should expect this because it's exceptional to see behavior which is mainstream, which i.e. plus 50% of consumers engaging with it. And if we think of the new era that we've moved into the video environment, where streaming has become normalized to the extent that TV is now de facto streaming TV, all the pre-digital behaviors around the division between subscription-based revenue models for the TV industry versus ad-supported models for free-to-air broadcast TV are being replicated and should be expected to be replicated in the digital context. So just under half of all subscribers have just under half of all consumers have a video subscription, and we can expect a subset of that to have more than one video subscription. We've seen an uptick. If you look at the latest quarter, there has been a noticeable uptick of 5% for +1 video subscriptions. And we've seen some marginal increase in overall video subscriptions. But the takeaway here is we're reaching organic limits of the ability of video subscription services to be able to continue to increase subscriptions. It's no longer possible. What it is possible to do is to keep increasing the number of multiple subscriptions up to that natural upper ceiling limit of approximately half the population. And that's before the real attention recession and the real economic recession start to fully impact, which are going to continue to have a dampening effect on overall growth, the growth trajectory for the video subscriber marketplace in H2 2022 and beyond. And with that, I'm going to pass you over to my colleague, Annie, who's going to give you the overview of the audio implications for the looming attention recession. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Tim. So during the pandemic, audio content, mostly podcasting, saw a spike in listenership. As we return from lockdowns to a new normalized schedule, the time and attention needed for podcasting will potentially revert back to pre-pandemic habits. As it stands, podcast listening is at 23% amongst all consumers, with 11% of podcast listeners consuming podcasts daily. This means that habitual podcast listenership is still at the beginning stages. However, the pandemic was a crucial growth factor, and without it, this growth would never have happened. Seeing as the current state of podcast listenership has not yet reached mainstream listenership, which again is over 50% penetration, we predict that podcast listenership will maintain or possibly decrease from this current point. However, as users sacrifice other subscription-based content, there may be an opportunity for the premium content of podcast subscriptions to grow in the wake of other content cancellations. In addition to the economic realities that are leading to subscription cancellations, there could be a desire amongst consumers, primarily those already listening to podcasts, for different high-quality content, which is where podcast subscriptions could be a good alternative. Especially as podcast videos are increasing in popularity, more of them are being offered as exclusive content for a subscription. In addition, these subscriptions are a great way to support independent creators, which may even be more appealing as the economic realities step in. And now I'll pass it on to Hannah, who will be switching gears from how people consume content to how people create content.
Thanks, Annie. Yes, so as the cultural trends analyst, we're going to switch back to a bit of a macro view. So prior to COVID-19, we had an attention recession, as we've established. Then lockdowns created an artificial opening in the market, which was a boom period where consumers had extra time and wallet share to spend on entertainment. This is coming to an end, but not only is this resulting in an attention time crunch, but a cost of living crisis is hastening the restriction of spend. This is not ideal. But what it truly highlights is just how much of the boom entertainment has experienced in the last year was actually artificial in a way, overemphasizing existing patterns rather than demonstrating how things were and are actually changing. The longer term cultural impact is going to be interesting because we are seeing more than one huge lifestyle shift at once. Big events have lasting cultural and psychological implications. On the one hand, we have the COVID effect. So younger consumers in particular have become accustomed to stop and start all or nothing behaviors. This is sort of the only way to live during COVID. And this behavior is going to, continue. But simultaneously, they are also getting used to creative behavior as a part of consumption, which is typically free on social platforms. So if we look at the next slide, we can actually see a bit of an example of this. There we go. We can see that while developed markets are already moving from lean back passive consumption to lean through consumption, so engaging, creating, posting. This in conjunction, or emerging markets are skipping the lean back altogether. This in conjunction with the youth-centric skew of this, so this is particularly prevalent amongst like 16 to generally 35-year-olds, but it's highest among the 20-24 segment, means that consumption is set to progress along this highly engaged trajectory over time, which will have implications for content and marketing strategy moving forward. Now, if we move to the next slide, however, we can see the other side of this. This demographics stop and start behavior when faced with the cost of living crisis is going to exacerbate the impacts on spending. So already we're seeing that socially creative consumers are more likely to spend in one-off transactions, particularly on other creators. They're also more interested in seeing all of their content in one place, we found, as opposed to having many separate subscriptions to many separate platforms as part of the attention saturation aspect of it. As the financial crunch causes consumers to lay off spending on many separate subscriptions for on-demand access to quote-unquote everything, which really isn't anymore, they will begin to cut those expenditures and instead focus their spending on more niche propositions and creators that have specific meaning to them. As a result, we'll see a rise in savvy switching behavior, sort of again, as well as a rise in one-off spends like on fan merchandise, but an overall decrease in the growth of subscription revenue en masse. This is not exactly new, so in any given mainstream audience, there's going to be a niche group of high spenders. This is just as true back in the era of those who purchased vinyls based on what they listen to on the radio, as it is now when you have super fans queuing around the block to buy limited edition merch while they're listening to the latest edition on their Bluetooth speakers, happening in where I am right now in London, actually. So rest assured, fandom is alive and well. Subscriptions may be about to face slightly turbulent times, but this type of consumption monetization is not under threat and may in fact become more prominent and important. So a focus on these fan-first spending behaviors might actually be familiar to those of you in gaming, which is a good note to hand you off to my colleague Carol, who's going to talk a little bit more about the impacts on that side of entertainment.
Thank you, Hannah. Hi, everyone. As you heard from our experts across entertainment sectors, it feels like a little bit of a gloomy outlook for entertainment. So I'm hopefully going to sort of half fill this half empty glass and talk about why we believe things could be different for games, and in particular for game streaming subscriptions. When it comes to sort of decreasing disposable income, yes, the spend in absolute terms will play a role, but arguably value as perceived by consumers will play just as important, if not a more important role. And in terms of perceived value, game subscriptions are actually in a lot more favorable stage of the sort of adoption cycle than, let's say, music and video. For all the things that are, of course, completely different across music, video, and games, there are also many similarities. And one is how consumers perceive value exchange when streaming services come into market. Let's take the example of video. The first stage, of the streaming service adoption, the sort of all access awe, as I call it, brings consumers a huge amount of incremental value. It essentially brings you from access to one thing, let's say one DVD's worth of content for 15 quid, to onto 1,000 DVDs worth of content for the same price. The first service then brings the most value, and as consumers go through that adoption cycle, each next one they adopt brings a bit less incremental value, until consumers realize that they have too many of these services and the value is no longer really justifiable as it once was. And now, of course, if you're going to have tightening disposable income during the recession at the same time, this will only catalyze the dynamic even more. So ultimately, in the phase of finding what I call the sort of self-rationalized equilibrium, there is a correction in the market as consumers start looking for value elsewhere. For example, in video and music, this will no longer be about more access and more content, but it will be, let's say, more about effective discovery and decluttering, etc. Now, while video and music are in the latter stages of the streaming service adoption cycle, as we heard already from my colleagues, in terms of these value exchange deliberations, game streaming services are actually still in their very early days. The incremental value provided for consumers by switching from, let's say, a $70 game to a $20 subscription with hundreds of games is incredible still in the eyes of the consumer, right? This is where game subscriptions still are in the eyes of the consumer. So while we may see consumers canceling one or two of their many video services, as Tim alluded to, as the disposable income tightens, we could well see consumers actually adopting game streaming services more quickly, because in their eyes, this will actually be a part of a money-saving exercise. Of course, absolute revenues might slow down in the short term, as the value of each individual game will be diluted over time under subscription models, as it happened with streaming in video and music in the past. But there will be an offset to an extent of this, due to at least partially at least due to in-game spending, as well as more sort of cross-entertainment spending taking place inside games more and more often. But that would be a whole different webinar. So in the meantime, if you are interested to dive a little deeper into this, you are most encouraged to reach out to us. And with my thanks, I will now hand you back to Mark for some closing remarks and questions. Thanks, everyone.
Brilliant. Thanks, Carol. So hopefully what you've been able to see from these presentations is, even though all of these media industries are really different, there's a lot of similarity in terms of what's going on. It's that because fundamentally it's all the same consumers. And that really, any of you who are familiar with MIDiA's work over the last few years, you'll recognize that one of the things that we say a lot is about how everything is becoming interconnected, interdependent, and intercompetitive as well. And that becomes never truer than it does now. We go back to when Reed Hastings said he was competing with Fortnite more than he was with HBO. Before that, when he said Netflix was competing with sleep, etc., etc. All these things are true. And the dynamics of what we've been talking about today are going to make it even more so. So for the remainder, what we're going to do is I'm going to fire a few quick questions to some of the analyst team, and then we're going to open up to questions from the audience. So do please submit your questions in the chat if you'd like to put one of your questions to the MIDiA team. So first of all, I'm going to go to Tim. I'm just wondering, Tim, how much do you think the attention recession and the global economic situation is already impacting subscriber growth in video? Obviously with Netflix's earnings, etc. And secondarily, how much is it going to impact in the long term?
So, two big questions, equally important for the future direction of travel for video. I say, in the first instance, there's been an assumption of accelerating appetite for multiple subscriptions in the video landscape, and this has been fueled by what MIDiA has described as the D2C Big Bang moment of 2019-2021, where the disruption unleashed by Netflix's pivot into on-demand streaming back in 2007 has disrupted the TV industry to such an extent that TV networks and increasingly operators have stepped in to introduce their own direct-to-consumer services to compete. If you can't beat them, join them strategy. Now, that's inevitably led to a unbundling, a fragmentation of the TV experience. What we're seeing now, as you will have noticed from the slide which I shared, is there's actually a finite limit of number of subscriptions people are willing to tolerate, because the challenge which MIDiA identified back in 2014 for streaming services is something called the tyranny of choice. That it's one thing to have more content and more outstanding content than has ever been before in the history of entertainment. But if you don't have a layered, curated experience to be able to decide where you apply not just your discretionary spend, but your attention, then you get a tyranny of choice, that paralysis, that experience nearly everyone who's had a Netflix subscription will be familiar with the hours spent, not hours, but considerable amounts of time spent looking for relevant content. That leads to a natural upper limit. So that's going to happen anyway. What's likely to be impacted additionally is the inflation challenge that we've got. So if we've got 10% inflation, and there's 10 subscriptions out there for a consumer, that means that a consumer is going to have to ditch one of those 10 subscriptions to have the same standard of living in 12 months' time. That's the first time ever this has happened in the digital economy, and it has significant ramifications for the subscription model generally.
Great. Thanks, Tim. I think it's a really interesting point as well, that about the impact of inflation, because over in the music industry, there's lots of jealous, covetous glances sort of put over to Netflix and saying, look how much Netflix has been able to raise its prices over all these years, where Spotify and other streaming services have hardly moved and therefore have deflated in real terms. But now actually that lack of price inflation, or the very small amount of it that happened in music, may actually prove to be to music's advantage. Because if music is significantly deflated in real terms compared to where it was 10 years ago, and video is significantly inflated in real terms as well as in absolute terms, then music is fundamentally going to be the better value product and the cheaper product in relative terms. And of course, you only need one of them. So anyway, so thanks for that, Tim. I'm going to stick with music for a moment, and questions for Tati. The attention recession is not just an industry level thing. When we think about, when we think about creators in music, in games, in video, etc., many of them, when we're talking about the mid and the long tail of creators, are really sort of like, scraping, eking out, sort of living, sustainable livings. And it doesn't take much to tip them over the edge. So I was wondering, Tati, what do you think record labels could do to help their artists get through the attention recession? Remember, we've already seen what happened with the pandemic and suddenly the downturn in live income and how that affected even some really quite well-established artists. What do you think record labels can do in this coming attention recession?
Yeah, it's a great question. And I mean, I think that the attention recession in some ways can actually boost the label proposition because, as you kind of alluded to, artists need more help than ever these days. They're competing not only with each other, but they're competing with all of entertainment for people's attention. And that's becoming increasingly hard. But I think the difference is that they need help with different things than they have in the past, and labels will need to sort of adjust to that. So as we were kind of getting out in the slides, fandom is moving up the value chain because it's what helps people decide what to spend their attention on. But right now, and for much of the past, record labels have been geared around building these more mass but often passive audiences to drive streaming, which has little to do with actual fandom. So labels need to sort of recalibrate away from that model of these mass but passive audiences and towards understanding different levels of fandom, sort of re-extracting the value from those super fans and more active fans within that, and overall just sort of moving towards this model of more niche audiences or niche fan bases rather than mass audiences. I also think, to dig a little deeper into something I brought up during the slides, as artists are earning more and more of their revenue from outside of their music and sort of grabbing from a bunch of different places for their revenue, labels are going to want to take part in that revenue, but that means that they will need to bolster what they can offer and how they're actually adding value to those spaces. So things like branding and merchandising, film and television, social content. So I think overall it's about a repositioning of value, but I think there's a lot that labels can do to support.
Perfect. I think there's already a bit of a running theme, and I think I'm about to sort of carry it on with the question I'm going to ask Hannah, which is the importance of your audience. It's the importance of understanding how much you matter to them and ensuring that you matter to them. And so that the idea of fandom and audiences, I think sort of value your audience is probably going to be the watchword for whatever industry you're in. So thanks for that, Tati. So question then for Hannah. Hannah, you spoke a lot about the idea of consumers as creators and this sort of sort of adjusting to the post-lockdown era. There's a bunch of sort of lockdown legacy behaviors, if you like, things that people started doing or did a lot more of when they were at home with time on their hands. And some of that has started to contract and recede as we go back to normal, but some of it's sticking around. I'm just wondering how much of that trend of the lockdown legacy, if you like, in terms of behaviors, is going to be affected by what might start happening as a result of the attention economy?
Sure. I mean, it's the big philosophical question, right? Is we've seen a lot of changes over the last 2 years. We saw a boom in subscriptions. We saw a boom in spending. We saw a boom in just consumers engaging with digital entertainment more broadly. But beneath this, we saw shifts in how they were doing so. So these creative behaviors are being enabled by tools like TikTok. Instagram introduces Reels, YouTube introduces Shorts, and it's no longer enough to just for these particularly younger consumers, which is now what they're very used to. It's no longer enough for them to just sit there and listen or sit there and watch. It's about what they can do about it next. And this isn't entirely new. Again, we've always had super fans, but this is now becoming more normalized, more enabled, more a way for these audiences to socialize with each other and to engage with each other. And that's not going away. So while spending is going to be impacted, entertainment is always something that people turn to in times of duress. They're the stories that they, listen to help them find a way forward and to have their emotions reflected back at them. And so entertainment is going to become ever more important. And while some of these things like subscriptions and some revenue models may be disrupted, the underpinning of why entertainment is important and what about it is important to people is going to remain. And they're just way more engaged now than they were before. And those habits are there to stay.
Perfect. Good answer. Okay, so let's shift to another format here. We're sort of talking about audio, which Annie covered off. I'm thinking particularly around podcasts. What, if any, type of sort of innovation or changes around formats, Annie, do you think need to be done in order to help ensure that podcasts maintain their share of ear? And what I mean by that is, during the pandemic, during lockdown, audiobooks and podcasts absolutely boomed. Music went down a bit. And then as we started coming out of the lockdown era, we've obviously seen music really rebounded very strongly. Podcasts continued to grow really strongly, but audiobooks beginning to taper off a little bit, losing some of that lockdown boom. So what can podcasts do format-wise to try to make sure they navigate the attention recession in a sort of slightly more predictable manner than they did the lockdown era?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, it makes sense though, because podcasts and audiobooks are two formats that are typically longer in time. Longer in time needs more attention, and both time and attention are going down in this recession. So it makes sense that there's some sort of format change that has to happen for both of these types of content. And there's a case for just making both these types of content shorter in time, whether that's doing bite-sized versions, 30-minute clips, or being able to customize how much time you actually had to listen to that content could be cool to entice new listeners, as well as, like I said earlier, any sort of video or visual to kind of bring on those new ears, to kind of get something else to bring your attention to, could help boost the format in this time.
Great. Okay. Thanks, Annie. So I'm going to finish up with a question for Carol before I go to audience questions. So clearly you probably gathered there's essentially two key strands going on here. On the one hand, we're talking about the attention recession, which is that constraint of available time that people have got. And that's very much what Annie just spoke about now. And then we're also talking about the cost of living crisis. And of course, these two things interplay, which is why we're talking about them together. But Carol spoke a bit more about things in terms of the affordability and consumer spending side. So you made a couple of points, Carol, about the sort of the relative perceived value of things, and how you see that relative perceived value within game subscriptions will remain so much stronger, and that's why they're probably going to be better placed for holding on to subscribers throughout the attention recession, and indeed the what may even be a proper economic recession as well now, according to the World Bank. So my question for you is, okay, so games might do better. What type of games companies are going to do better?
Right. Well, great question. You have all, in one way or another, mentioned the word value. And really, this is kind of the really crucial part. And there are actually many different ways, different types of companies can deliver value as perceived, or incremental value as perceived by the consumers. The value needs to improve to what they thought it was, a year or two ago. So you've got different types of value you can deliver. One is the sort of, money saving value, the likes of, sort of my big bet is obviously on the sort of game streaming, subscription services, etc. And even more so, potentially on ones that aren't completely fully just dependent on games revenue, sort of the tech majors, etc., such as Microsoft, etc., who have got end games beyond just gaming, and actually will be able to probably sort of fund reasonably lower price points than let's say pure play games companies. So that's obviously one part and one way of delivering value. Another way of delivering value, though, is in sort of providing some sort of, let's say, cross entertainment experiences, in terms of games worlds. Let's remember, all gamers, they are also, music fans. They are also video consumers. And now the games industry is getting better and better at being able to extract some of that value. So, the likes of, Epic Games is Fortnite, the world of Roblox, or the amazing kind of music work that the team at Riot Games have been up to, over the last couple of years. And then you've got another, and I would say kind of the final part, the final point I was going to make here is kind of the games companies that can bring value in terms of improved sense of belonging or self-fulfillment. And I'm kind of alluding towards the more and more pertinent, era of creators and creation, and whereby creation is becoming very quickly part of the consumption process itself. So you've got, like one of the recent announcements, 100 Thieves is making a game, right? But they are involving their whole community from day one, literally from the first line of code. All of these super enthusiastic gamers, valuable spenders and consumers, not just on games, but across entertainment, as we know, are going to feel that they actually are leaving a serious mark in something they sort of really care about. So all of these things, we are talking a lot about value, and the value always kind of seems to strike the sort of monetary association at the very, I guess, as an immediate first thought. But I would advise companies to be cognizant of, there are many different types of value and many different ways you can improve perceived value. But there needs to be something. If your only incremental value at the moment that you're planning to add to consumers over the next year is that you are working on a great new game, you are approaching the oncoming financial and attention recession in a wrong manner. You need to find the way to provide something incremental. That's my 2 cents, Mark.
Perfect. All right. Thanks, Carl. Okay, so I think we've got time for a couple of questions from the audience, and also if you want to fire any in, do so. So I think the first one was asking about it's to the effect of how much the boom, then the boost to music that we've seen, how much of that is artificially inflated by the current market dynamics, and to what degree is that actually forcing the amount that people are paying for music and IP, whether that be labels, publishers, funds, etc., whether they're being pushed too high as a consequence. I think I'd say this. My colleague Annie, who you heard from before, she's working on a new report in our audio service at the moment, which is looking at the shift in audio consumption in total hours over the course of the last sort of year and a bit. So that's not just the average time spent, it's not just the size of the audience, but it's the product of those two things, the average time spent times by the audience, so you get the total amount of hours. And the really interesting thing is that, music didn't grow as fast in percentage terms as podcasts. Podcasts grew the fastest, but because music was already so big, a smaller level of growth contributed the most hours growth in total time spent. So something like more than 4/5 of the extra time people are spending with audio now compared to more than a year ago is because of listening to streaming music more. So there is no doubt that as people are beginning to commute again, be on trains, sat at the desk, going to the gym, whatever it might be, music is coming back and getting its role again. So for those reasons, I would say that the boost to music listening is being sustained and probably points to actual increased demand in an organic sense rather than inorganic sense. With regards to whether there is a overpaying for IP, well, I suspect that the premiums which are being paid have far more to do with the imbalance of supply and demand in the music catalog M&A space than it is to actual market dynamics. But it can't help, that's for sure. Okay, I think there's one other question someone was asking about one of your earlier slides, and I just wanted to clarify it a little bit, which was asking about where were we forecasting there would be a 20% decline in music subscriptions. We're not forecasting a 20% decline. When we ask consumers, what do you think you would cut back on if you found that you didn't have, you were finding it difficult to make ends meet because of the increase in the cost of living, what would you do with your entertainment behavior? So we get them all the list of the various things you see about, different subscriptions to cancel, and also going out less, eating out less, going to concerts less. 20% of people who currently have a music subscription, they said that they would consider cancelling the music subscription and going back to a free tier or just using YouTube, or even doing without. That's not to say it's going to happen, but it does give you an indication of if things get rough in the wider economic context, then yes, absolutely, music subscriptions are going to be vulnerable, and in some ways they have a vulnerability that video subscriptions do not. As much as it might be a pain for Netflix that people can cancel Netflix for a few months because they've got all these other services going and then pop back into Netflix sometime in the future, what music has is if you don't have your music subscription, you can still get exactly the same content on YouTube or on the free tier of your subscription. Yes, you've got to tolerate ads. Yes, you can't put it on take it offline. And yes, also you may have constraints on exactly what sequence you listen to music and etc. But if fundamentally music consumption is shifting much more towards passive listening, it's what you put on in the background while you do other stuff, and more people are still spending more time at home than they did pre-pandemic, then actually going into an attention recession and an economic recession, I think there is some vulnerability there for music. Will it be a 20% decline? I don't think so. I think the most likely scenario is a slowdown in growth, increased churn. So some services may struggle, but the overall market should remain pretty stable. And indeed, hopefully should grow in a lot of markets as well. Don't forget that the economic slowdown is being particularly felt in Western markets, less so in other markets. So, it may well be that Sub-Saharan Africa, South and East Asia, maybe those regions may well continue to prosper in the digital economy, even when Europe isn't. Okay, so I think we're done now in terms of questions. So what I'll just do is say thank you very much indeed for all of you having joined us today. And I hope you found the conversation useful and interesting. We're going to be launching an Attention Recession research practice at MIDiA soon, so keep tuned for details on that. And I'm going to hand you over now to my colleague Sion. Thanks, everyone.
Thank you, Mark. Thank you so much, everyone, for joining today as well. So if you'd like to have access to the presentation from today, you can find it on our website. It will be uploaded later today. And also for everyone who did sign up to today's webinar, you'll also be able to access it as I will send it out. Thank you so much again for joining us. And yeah, have a great rest of your day.